According to every physicist who reviewed Nikola Tesla's death ray proposal in the 1930s, it was scientifically impossible. The concept required focusing particle beams with precision that didn't exist. It needed energy sources decades beyond current technology. The mathematics, they said, simply didn't work. The U.S. War Department officially dismissed it in 1937 as unworkable theory. But here's what they didn't know, or pretended not to know. In 1958, just 15 years after Tesla's death, the United States tested experimental particle beam weapons at secret facilities in New Mexico. By the 1980s, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were pouring billions into directed energy systems under programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's so-called Star Wars. And today, modern militaries openly deploy directed energy weapons capable of disabling aircraft, satellites, and missiles. All of them are built on principles strikingly similar to what Tesla described back in 1934. Accelerated particles, focused beams, concentrated energy at range. So the question is not just, was Tesla's death ray real? The question is, did the world quietly spend the next 80 years turning his impossible idea into a weapon it still doesn't fully admit exists? To understand the death ray, we need to go back to the early 1930s, a time when the world was still haunted by the memory of World War I and already sliding toward a second, even more catastrophic conflict. Nikola Tesla was in his late 70s, living mostly in hotels, deeply in debt, and largely ignored by the mainstream scientific community. The man who had helped create the modern electrical age now seemed like a relic from another century. Newspapers occasionally mentioned him, but usually in a tone halfway between respect and amusement. The eccentric old genius feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, making wild predictions about the future. And yet, Tesla was still thinking about war. He'd watched the First World War tear Europe apart. He believed, correctly, that the next war would be even worse, fought with aircraft, mechanized armies, and far more destructive weapons. And he became obsessed with a single idea. If he could build a weapon so terrifying, so absolute, that no nation would dare attack another, then war itself might become impossible. Not because humans became kinder, not because diplomacy suddenly worked, but because the price of aggression would be instant annihilation. He called it a beam of force, later dubbed by the press as the death ray. Tesla hated the phrase death ray. He insisted it wasn't a ray at all. In his mind, this wasn't a Hollywood laser or a sci-fi light beam. It was a stream of solid particles, microscopic bits of matter accelerated to incredible speeds, packed into an invisible column of destruction. According to Tesla, the system had four main components: a particle generator, a device that would create tiny, charged particles or droplets of material; a super high-voltage accelerator, using principles similar to his high-frequency transformers. This would hurl those particles to astonishing velocities; a focusing mechanism, electromagnetic lenses and guiding fields to keep the particles confined into a narrow, coherent beam; a transmission path. The beam would travel through the air and strike targets hundreds of kilometers away, where its kinetic energy would tear them apart. Tesla claimed this beam could destroy aircraft, melt engine blocks, and even punch through armor. He told reporters it could create an invisible Chinese wall around a nation, an impenetrable defensive shell that would make invasion impossible. To his critics, this sounded insane. In the 1930s, particle physics was still in its infancy. Cyclotrons were just being built. High-energy beams existed only in laboratory experiments, in carefully controlled vacuum chambers, over distances of a few centimeters. The idea of projecting a stable particle beam through kilometers of atmosphere sounded like pure fantasy. Physicists raised immediate objections. Air would scatter the particles and diffuse the beam. The energy required to accelerate enough particles to be militarily useful would be enormous. Focusing the beam over long distances seemed impossible with the technology of the time. From a conventional 1930s perspective, they were right. On paper, the death ray looked like a mountain of engineering problems stacked on top of theoretical gaps. But Tesla wasn't working from their perspective. He believed he had already solved many of these issues through decades of research into high-voltage, high-frequency systems. He had spent his life experimenting with ways to transmit energy through air and earth. Where other scientists saw empty space, Tesla saw a medium filled with fields and potentials waiting to be manipulated. He insisted the death ray was not just an idea, but a fully worked-out design. He never built a full-scale version. He claimed doing so would be too dangerous, but he produced technical drawings, calculations, and detailed descriptions outlining exactly how it would be done. At least, that's what he said. Those drawings have never been publicly released. If the death ray had been just another wild statement from an aging inventor, the story would have ended there. A few newspaper articles, some amused editorials, and then silence. But that's not what happened. Between 1934 and 1937, Nikola Tesla quietly approached 4 different governments with his weapon design: the United States, his adopted homeland; the United Kingdom, facing the growing threat of Nazi Germany; the Soviet Union, racing to modernize its military; and Yugoslavia, the country of his birth, hoping for any advantage in a dangerous world. He didn't simply send letters. He engaged in active negotiation. He requested meetings. He wrote confidential proposals. The U.S. War Department reviewed his designs and, officially, turned them down. Internal assessments reportedly labeled the concept as impractical and beyond current technical capability. Yet, American officials kept copies of the proposal, and after Tesla's death in 1943, those same officials ordered an immediate seizure of all his papers, with special interest in anything related to directed energy or long-range weaponry. The Soviet Union sent representatives to meet Tesla in person. According to later accounts, they paid him for at least preliminary technical information, a serious investment in a concept supposedly considered impossible. The British government filed Tesla's proposals in secret defense archives, stamped with, "For future consideration." Yugoslavia received what Tesla described as partial working drawings, which later became part of the collection in Belgrade's Tesla Museum, though the most sensitive documents remain inaccessible or missing. So what was going on? Were 4 governments collectively wasting time and money on the fantasies of an old man? Or did they see something in Tesla's work that isn't obvious from the outside? At minimum, their behavior proves one thing. Tesla's death ray was taken seriously at the highest levels of power, at least as a possibility. Fast forward a few decades. Tesla is dead. The Second World War has come and gone, fought not with death rays, but with tanks, bombers, and, ultimately, nuclear weapons. The world has entered the Cold War. 2 superpowers now face each other with arsenals capable of ending human civilization, and both are desperate for any technology that might tip the balance. Suddenly, the impossible starts looking necessary. In the 1950s, U.S. scientists begin seriously studying charged particle beams as potential weapons. Classified projects at national labs explore ways to accelerate ions and electrons to extraordinarily high energies and direct them in controlled streams. In 1958, experimental beam weapons are reportedly tested in secure facilities in the American Southwest. While details remain classified, unclassified patents and declassified memos from the era show an intense interest in directed energy devices and charged particle ray systems. By the 1980s, particle beam weapons are a central part of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program. Officially, Many of these systems are theoretical or under research, but the basic concepts look strikingly familiar. Accelerated charged particles, magnetic focusing, high-voltage power systems, long-range targeting of aircraft and missiles. At the same time, other directed energy weapons, high-power lasers and microwave systems are being developed and tested. Modern militaries may not call them death rays, but they are exactly that in functional terms. Beams of concentrated energy used to disable or destroy targets at a distance. So, the exact technology that was mocked as impossible in Tesla's time becomes a central focus of weapons research just 1 or 2 generations later. Of course, defenders of the Tesla was just dreaming position can argue. Technology advanced, physics matured, engineering improved. Maybe Tesla had the rough idea, but not the math or hardware to make it real. Yet the overlap between what he claimed and what eventually emerged is hard to ignore. The same physical principles, the same strategic goals, the same obsession with making attacks so costly that war becomes unthinkable. To separate myth from reality, we have to look carefully at what Tesla himself actually said about the death ray, not the exaggerated versions in newspapers, but his own words. In interviews and statements from the mid-1930s, Tesla made several specific, testable claims. The device would use non-dispersive particle streams, not light or conventional radiation. It would require extremely high voltages, far beyond normal power lines, which he believed could be achieved with his own transformer designs. It would be fundamentally a defensive weapon, unable to be used for offensive invasion, only for protecting borders. It would make conventional armies and air forces obsolete because any massed attack would be instantly annihilated at range. He insisted multiple times that he had solved the core physical problems, especially beam dispersion. He claimed the beam would travel through a controlled channel in the air, created by ionizing molecules along its path, a sort of temporary tunnel of conductive gas guiding the particles. This idea is not as crazy as it sounded in the 1930s. Later, plasma physics and high-intensity laser research would discover similar phenomena. Channels carved through air, filaments of ionized gas guiding energy. Was Tesla guessing? Or had he glimpsed something real through his decades of experimenting with high-frequency discharges and atmospheric electricity? He also spoke ominously about the consequences of misuse. In one statement, he warned that if a single nation monopolized this technology, it could dominate the world. That's why he claimed to be offering it to multiple governments, to ensure a kind of enforced balance. In other words, he was proposing a pre-nuclear version of mutually assured destruction. A world where no one fires the first shot because the cost is automatic devastation. On paper, the US government's response was simple: rejection. Internal memos from the era described Tesla's proposal as purely speculative and unlikely to produce meaningful results with present technology. Military planners were focused on more immediate weapons, tanks, bombers, naval fleets, and, increasingly, the race to unlock nuclear fission. From their standpoint, Tesla was a distraction, an old man promising miracle weapons with no working prototype, no test data, and a long history of overpromising. But there's a difference between what governments say publicly and what they do privately. Because even as they dismissed the death ray, they kept copies of his technical proposals, placed references to his directed energy ideas into classified files, and most tellingly, after his death, launched an urgent operation to secure every scrap of paper he left behind. If the death ray was just nonsense, why did they care so much about his notes? One possibility is simple caution. In wartime, you don't ignore even a small chance that an adversary might turn nonsense into something deadly. Better to lock everything away than risk letting it fall into the wrong hands. Another possibility is more unsettling, that within the speculative material, Government scientists saw seeds of concepts that could, with enough time and money, become real. Seeds worth taking, and then officially pretending never existed. Years after Tesla's death, when a portion of his papers were finally released to his family and transferred to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade, researchers expected to finally see the death ray blueprints. They didn't. The museum's collection includes references to Teleforce and scattered notes about beam weapons, but the core design documents, the complete, step-by-step descriptions Tesla insisted existed, are either missing or still classified somewhere else. Curators have occasionally hinted that certain materials cannot be shown for security reasons. Other times, they claim those particular documents never arrived. A few items appear to have been returned, anonymously, years after Tesla's estate was initially processed, suggesting that at least some of his work passed through unofficial hands before reaching Belgrade. It's like a puzzle with key pieces deliberately removed, enough to show the outline of something extraordinary, but not enough to prove it. This gap creates a fertile ground for theories. Maybe the death ray was never fully documented, just a collection of ideas Tesla never finished. Maybe the full design existed, but was destroyed by cautious officials who feared its implications. Or maybe the most complete blueprints were selectively removed and integrated into classified weapons programs, with only harmless fragments allowed to surface. Whatever the truth, the effect is the same. Tesla's death ray remains stuck in limbo, too documented to dismiss as pure myth, too incomplete to confirm as reality. If we strip away the legends and look only at the timeline, a pattern emerges. 1930s. Tesla describes a particle beam weapon. Experts say it's impossible. 1940s to 50s. Nuclear weapons dominate, but classified research into high-energy beams quietly begins. 1960s to 80s. Major superpowers invest heavily in directed energy weapons, including particle beams. 2000s to today. Operational directed energy systems enter service. Laser and microwave weapons publicly, other systems likely in secret. From a distance, it looks like the world spent decades catching up to a concept Tesla tried to hand them in the 1930s. Critics argue this is hindsight bias, that we're retrofitting Tesla into a story he barely belongs in. After all, he didn't have working hardware. He didn't run full-scale tests. He didn't publish detailed physics in peer-reviewed journals. Supporters counter that this is exactly Tesla's pattern. He conceptualized alternating current systems long before they became standard. He imagined wireless communication and global information networks decades before cell phones and the Internet. He explored resonance, high-frequency fields, and wireless transmission in ways later researchers would revisit with new tools and vocabulary. The death ray, they argue, is just another example of Tesla getting there early, too early for his contemporaries to understand, but just early enough that future generations could quietly adapt his ideas. There is another possibility we have to confront honestly, that Tesla's death ray was both real and a bluff. By the 1930s, Tesla was financially desperate. He needed attention. He needed investors. He needed to prove he was still relevant in a world that had moved on. It is entirely possible that he oversold what he actually had, that his designs were more speculative than he admitted, his calculations less certain than he claimed. He might have believed the underlying physics were sound, even if he hadn't nailed down every engineering detail. So he took what he had, partial concepts, preliminary math, decades of intuition, and packaged it as a finished weapon system. Not because he wanted to deceive, but because he knew no one funds maybe in a world racing toward war. If that's true, then the death ray becomes a strange hybrid, a partial blueprint containing truths that would later prove valuable. Wrapped in exaggeration and confident rhetoric aimed at capturing attention, then seized, classified, and quietly mined for whatever could be turned into real hardware. In other words, Tesla may have been bluffing about how complete his death ray was, but governments may have been bluffing about how useless it was. Both sides playing a game of controlled perception around an idea whose full potential no one completely understood. Tesla dreamed of a weapon so terrifying it would end war forever. History took a different path. Instead of particle beams, the world embraced nuclear weapons as its ultimate deterrent. Mutually assured destruction became the grim logic of the Cold War, not because of Tesla's death ray, but because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet, in the shadows, research into directed energy weapons never stopped. Today, the same principles Tesla talked about are used to shoot down drones, disable electronics, target missiles, possibly do things we still haven't been told about. So did Tesla's death ray fail? In one sense, yes. It didn't stop World War II. It didn't create a perfect defensive shield. It didn't become the single weapon that ended all weapons. But in another sense, it succeeded more than he could have imagined, not as a single machine, but as a roadmap. A roadmap that led to a world where beams of energy silently replace bullets in certain kinds of warfare, where the line between science fiction and military doctrine becomes very thin, where the sky can be swept by invisible forces that disable anything they touch. Somewhere, in a locked cabinet or digital archive, there may still be a folder labeled Teleforce or Beam of Force, containing the notes of an old man who saw too far ahead. A man dismissed in public, studied in private, and perhaps borrowed from without acknowledgement. We may never know exactly how much of today's directed energy technology traces back to Tesla's impossible idea. But the pattern is hard to ignore. First, they laughed. Then, they classified. Then, they built. And Tesla's death ray, whether fully real, half real, or not quite real at all, became part of the invisible architecture of modern warfare. He wanted to create a world where war was too costly to fight. Instead, we got a world where weapons keep getting smarter, more precise, and less visible. Maybe the most unsettling part of this story isn't whether Tesla's death ray worked. It's that in trying to prevent the worst version of humanity, he may have helped invent its next one. If you want to see how Tesla's vision of global wireless power connects to modern energy control and why that dream was shut down, join the next episode of the Tesla Files. And if you think some technologies are still being kept from us, you're not alone. Subscribe, and let's keep pulling on the threads they told us not to touch.